Okay, hello everybody. Welcome to another class where we look at commas in the books around us. And as I explained yesterday, I do a lot of work now with commas, and I speak to a lot of other English teachers about commas and where they go and why they go in the places that they go. So let's have a look at another book today, and this is a page which is great for showing absolute phrases. Now, not every comma is on this page to show an absolute phrase. Okay, I'm sorry about that. I'll have to turn that off and on because I haven't worked out how to use this monitor properly yet. It's actually an old monitor, and I swapped it with my new monitor so that my son could have a nice monitor for his new console. So if we look at this first sentence, I want to make it clear that this first sentence is not an absolute phrase. We've got the world is shriveling beyond the windows, comma, darkening at the edges and blackening at the centre. So immediately we should notice that there's no Oxford comma here. And that means that this book is probably from Britain, that somebody has written it who's English. And so there's no Oxford comma here, but what we have is a sentence with three verbs. We've got the world is shriveling beyond the windows, darkening at the edges and blackening at the centre. So you might want to consider this three participles, although I generally don't. I usually call these words, and I mean shriveling, darkening and blackening, I usually call them verbs. But they will be referred to as participles in the grammar books. And so here we have a list of three verbs, or if you prefer, a list of three participles. But I see these three, I call them verbs because these three words, and I mean shriveling, darkening and blackening, they all have a subject, which is the world. And they have the auxiliary verb here, the S, which apostrophe S, which represents the word is. So we've got the world is shriveling beyond the windows, the world is darkening at the edges, and the world is blackening at the centre. And for that reason, I call them verbs rather than participles, just because for me, when the word has a subject and that auxiliary verb in there, it's really clear that it's acting as a verb. But if you want to call them three participles, I don't see anything wrong with that at all, because you may consider it as one main clause, the world is shriveling beyond the windows, and then two participles describing the subject of the main clause, darkening at the edges and blackening at the centre, describing the world. There's no difference between the two models. Okay, let's look at the next sentence then. The hunters are beginning to emerge from the forest, comma, waddling across the lawn like overgrown birds. Now, again, this is quite an interesting sentence. You can consider it in two ways, and I don't really see any difference between the two models. We could consider it one main clause, the hunters are beginning to emerge from the forest, and then a participle phrase, waddling across the lawn like overgrown birds, a participle phrase that describes the subject, hunters, of the main clause, yeah? You could consider it like that, or you can consider it as two verbs again. The hunters are beginning to emerge from the forest, and they are waddling across the lawn like overgrown birds. But these two verbs don't have an and between them, and because they don't have an and, you do need this comma here. Okay, so there's a good reason for that comma being there. And I don't know if you've watched some of my other videos, but when you miss a conjunction between between members in a list where we would normally use a conjunction, then it's called asyndetic coordination. So you might see this as an example of asyndetic coordination where we're missing the word and so we must put a comma in there. So again, there are a few different ways you can see that you can model that sentence. Now, if we come on to the next sentence, having grown impatient in my parlour, waiting for Cunningham's return, this having grown impatient is clearly the participle. The having grown is the participle. It's a perfect participle, this having grown, and it describes the subject of the main clause. It describes this I. It's I who had grown impatient. So having grown impatient is describing the I, and because it's a participle phrase coming before the main clause, we need a comma, before the main clause starts. So there's a very good reason for all of those commas being there. And I mean, the first two you can just say lists. It's a list of 3 verbs, the first sentence. The second sentence is a list of 2 verbs, but there's no and. And the third sentence is a participle phrase, which is, of course, an incomplete thought, or an adjectival phrase if you prefer, and it's describing the subject of the main clause, so we need a comma before the main clause starts. Okay, if we come down to the second paragraph now, we've got some more interesting commas. We've got, a day of walking has sapped all my strength. Now, what you need to notice straight away is that is a main clause for sure. All of that is the main clause. It could sit on its own. We could make that first comma a full stop if we wanted. Then we have a noun phrase. We have this ponderous body, which is a noun phrase. And then we have the word growing, which is a participle. It is not a verb. To be a verb, it would have to say, this ponderous body is growing heavier by the second, and that would make that phrase a main clause. We'd have a subject, this ponderous body, a verb is growing, and then a complement, heavier by the second. But in this sentence, we don't have the auxiliary verb. That is, which we had in that very first sentence, the world is shriveling, that is missing. And that means that what we have here is an absolute phrase. Absolute phrases are when you have a main clause, and we've already got that, which is signified by the letter M. And then you have a noun phrase and something modifying that noun phrase. And usually it's a participle, and that's exactly what we've got. We've got this ponderous body, noun phrase, and then participle, growing. Growing is describing the ponderous body. Growing heavier by the second is describing the ponderous body. And so this is a typical absolute phrase. This is the kind of structure which you really want to look out for with absolute phrases, because most of the time you see noun phrase and then participle. Some of the time you see noun phrase and then prepositional phrase. And then sometimes you also see noun phrase and adjective. And of course, we do have an adjective here. We have ponderous. So we are already modifying the body with the word ponderous. So do look out for these absolute phrases. Usually it's noun phrase plus participle, could be noun phrase plus preposition, or noun phrase plus adjective. Or yesterday we saw one which was 2 noun phrases. So it's more like an appositive. There were 2 noun phrases in apposition. So there are a number of different ways a number of different forms that these absolute phrases can take. Let's look at the next sentence. To make matters worse. Now that's clearly an incomplete thought again, and so again we have that comma to show where the main clause is starting. To make matters worse is a 2+ infinitive phrase. It's not a participle phrase, but it shares many things in common with a participle phrase, because when you think about it, you've got a verb, to make, but you've got no subject. And it's the same with participle phrases. You have a verb that's sitting there like an adjective, and so it has no subject. You have something like having grown impatient. It has no subject. Okay, so to make matters worse, comma, because incomplete thought, I mean, some people would call that a subordinate clause, but I think it's better to call it a 2+ infinitive phrase, because phrases don't have subjects and verbs, and this doesn't have a subject and a verb. So to make matters worse, comma, the house is alive with activity. Now there's our main clause again. The house is alive with activity. And of course, that's why we need that first comma, to separate the incomplete thought from the complete thought. Then we have a noun, maids, and then we have the words plumping. Now notice that it doesn't say the maids are plumping. Again, the auxiliary verb is missing, so plumping is not a verb. We can't say maids plumping cushions as a complete thought. You'd need to say the maids are plumping cushions, or the maids were plumping cushions, or the maids will be plumping cushions. You need to put it into a continuous tense with an auxiliary verb. But we don't have that, so what we've got is a participle. So again, we've got a noun, maids, and then a participle modifying that noun, maids plumping cushions and arranging flowers. So this is another excellent example of an absolute phrase. The ponderous body growing heavier, the maids plumping cushions, and yesterday we had lights flashing, I think, I can't remember, no, lights blinding me we had, and we had the entire thing coughing. We didn't have the entire thing is coughing, we didn't have the lights were blinding me, they were missing that auxiliary verb, and that's the signal that you've got a participle describing a noun, which means you've got an absolute phrase. Okay, so we've got an absolute phrase right in the middle here. We've got a 2 plus infinitive phrase, then a main clause, then an absolute phrase where it says maids plumping cushions and arranging flowers, and then we've got a comma and we've got the participle darting. Now, of course, darting is referring to the maids. The maids were darting this way and that. And so here we've got a participle phrase, but because it's not describing the flowers, darting is clear, it's not the flowers that were darting this way and that. So it's describing a word further back in the sentence, so we need a participle comma before the word darting. So this is a participle phrase coming after the absolute phrase. So what's the difference between a participle phrase and an absolute phrase? Well, the difference is simple. Participle phrases start with participles. Absolute phrases start with nouns, and then they have the participle, and they don't have the auxiliary verb. That's really important. So darting this way and that is a participle phrase, but maids plumping cushions is an absolute phrase. This ponderous body growing is an absolute phrase. But having grown impatient is a participle phrase again, because it starts with the participle. Okay, so nice, simple difference there to remember. Participle phrases start with participles, absolute phrases start with nouns, and then they modify that noun. And they mustn't have an auxiliary verb between the noun and the participle, otherwise you've got a main clause. Okay, if we come to the next sentence, which is I am embarrassed by their vigour, cowed by their grace. First thing to notice is that there's a comma between the embarrassed by their vigour, cowed by their grace. The second thing to do is to think what kind of word is embarrassed, what kind of word is cowed. Now, if anybody out there thinks adjective, you're absolutely right. If anybody out there thinks participle, you're absolutely right, because they are both participles and adjectives. Participles are adjectives, and so they're participles and they're adjectives. And secondly, notice that we could replace the comma with the word and. I am embarrassed by their vigour and cowed by their grace. So again, we could consider this asyndetic coordination. We're dropping the conjunction for some reason. And whenever you can replace the comma with an and, I always recommend seeing if you can swap the two phrases round. Can you say, I am cowed by their grace, embarrassed by their vigour? Yes, you can. So what we have here is interchangeable adjectival phrases. And interchangeable adjectival phrases always need a comma. They are coordinate adjectival phrases. They are totally equal, and they both describe the I in the sentence in an equal way, and for that reason these are coordinate participle phrases. And I want you to also notice the beautiful parallel structure with the embarrassed by their vigour, cowed by their grace. You've got that repetition of the by there, and that's why it sounds very nice. That repetition is quite poetic, and it shows good parallel structure. Okay, let's come down to the next paragraph. We start the next sentence with a lovely subordinate clause, really. We've got a prepositional phrase first, by the time, and then we've got a subordinate clause, that I enter the entrance hall. Now, I know it doesn't say that, the word that, but it is implied here. But that by the time that I enter the entrance hall is your subordinate clause. It's an incomplete thought. I call it a clause this time because it does have a subject and a verb. It has I enter. This is a subordinate clause, and when subordinate clauses come first, before the main clause, you need to put that comma in. So this is sub comma main. So by the time I enter the entrance hall, comma, it's filled with hunters shaking the rain from their caps. Now notice that this shaking is also a participle. It doesn't say the hunters are shaking or were shaking the rain from their caps. But notice that this shaking is describing the word right before it. It's describing this noun. It's describing the hunters. And that's why this participle doesn't need a comma before it. It's describing the word before it, so no comma. If it's only when the participle goes further back in the sentence, I think, yeah, like what we had with darting. Darting wasn't describing flowers, darting was describing maids, and so we needed a comma before it. But this shaking is describing the word before it, it's describing hunters, so no comma before it. Okay, then we've got, it's filled with hunters shaking the rain from their caps. That's your main clause. It could stand on its own again. Sorry about my writing, it's never very good with a mouse, I'm afraid. So that's your main clause. And then we've got a noun, puddles, and then a word forming. Now, forming here is a participle. It doesn't say the puddles were forming or are forming. So again, we've got noun plus modifier. And again, it's called an absolute phrase. Puddles forming at their feet. Notice the similarities between this ponderous body growing, maids plumping, puddles forming, lights blinding, the entire thing coughing. We've done quite a few of these absolute phrases now, and most of the time you see a noun plus a participle. Most of the time. Okay, let's go on to the next one. They are soaking wet and grey with cold, comma. Now notice that that's a main clause. They are soaking wet and grey with cold, comma. The life washed right out of them. So again we have noun, the life, and then we have participle, washed. I know this one doesn't end in ing. This is not a present participle, it's a past participle. But again, it doesn't say the life is washed right out of them or the life was washed right out of them, because that would be a main clause. This is just noun plus modifier. So it's absolute phrase again, the life washed. Yeah, so again, notice the similarity. Ponderous body growing, maids plumping, puddles forming, the life washed right out of them. So again, you always need a comma with an absolute phrase. It doesn't matter if it goes at the beginning, at the end, in the middle, interrupting the main clause. It'll have two commas then, but it needs commas always. So let's look at one which is in the middle. Look at the next sentence. My eyes downcast. Now, it is not simple past tense, the life washed right out of them. It certainly isn't. The life is not the subject of the verb washed. Washed is not a verb here. Washed is an adjective describing the life. If the life were the subject of the verb, that would mean that the life would be washing something. The life washed something, and it didn't wash anything. The life, it's passive basically. The life was washed right out of them, and so it's describing the life here. It is not a verb in a past simple tense. It's actually much more similar to the next absolute phrase, which is my eyes downcast. So here we've got an absolute phrase that is interrupting the main clause. Notice that it starts with a noun, my eyes, and then it describes that noun, downcast. So this absolute phrase doesn't have a participle, it just has an adjective next to the noun, modifying the noun. But this absolute phrase is surrounded by commas because it comes in the middle of I pass through nervously, wondering if any of these scowling faces. Yeah, it interrupts that main clause, and so we need a comma on both sides. But please don't think of these participles as finite verbs in simple past tense. The life washed right out of them is not a finite verb in the past simple tense. It looks like it. I can see how people might mistake it for a verb in the past simple tense, but it is not a verb in the past simple tense. It's actually a participle. It's a past participle describing the noun. The noun isn't operating on the verb. Okay, so let's carry on. Lucy Harper Let me see if I can get this further down. That looks all right. Lucy Harper told me that he had a broken nose when he visited the kitchen, which gives me some hope. Now, whenever you see a which next to a comma, the first thing you really need to think is non-defining relative clause, because that's what it usually is, and that's what we can call this one. But I wanted to alert your attention to the fact that the which here, the relative pronoun, is actually referring to the entire previous clause. It's not referring to the kitchen, it's not referring to the nose, it's not standing in for that noun. It's not the kitchen which gives me some hope, and it's not the nose that gives me some hope. It's the whole thing. The fact that he told me that he had a broken nose when he visited the kitchen is what gives me some hope that my hosts are fighting back. And this is called something strange. I think it's called a sentential relative clause. You'll have to look that one up. Sentential, I think. I'm not 100% certain, but it's a weird relative clause where the relative clause doesn't refer to one noun, it refers to the whole previous clause. And I know that in some style guides this is unacceptable. This is incorrect. You should only use relative pronouns to refer to nouns and not use them to refer to whole clauses. But that's just a little extra piece of information if anyone's interested. So we got non-defining relative clause. And then we've got an interesting comma here, right at the bottom, where we say, which gives me some hopes that my hosts are fighting back, comma, not to mention an easy way of picking him out. Now here, sometimes when you see a comma, it's quite useful to think of what it might mean if you take the comma out. Now, if you take the comma out, it starts to sound like it gives me some hope that my hosts are fighting back, not to mention. They are fighting back in order, not to mention an easy way. Can you see how it starts to read differently? It starts to read as if my hosts are fighting back in order, not to mention an easy way of picking him out. And we don't want to say that. So really, this not to mention an easy way of picking him out, an easy way of picking him out is referring back to what it gives you. It gives me two things. It gives me some hope, blah, 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 and it gives me an easy way of picking him out. Now, because this goes back to what it gives you some hope and it gives you an easy way of picking him out, we need that comma here. We really need this comma just to show that this is referring back to an earlier part of the sentence. It's referring back to what it gives you. It gives you some hope, blah, 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 and it gives you, not to mention it gives you an easy way of picking him out. So I hope you can all see that that comma is really necessary, even though it's perhaps not on my list of comma rules. Okay, the next part, seeing no injuries, comma, I. Well, the seeing is describing the I. It's a regular participle where you start with participle phrase, comma, main clause. I continue more confidently, comma, the hunters standing aside. So the writer has decided to give us yet another absolute phrase. The hunters, noun, standing, participle. It doesn't say the hunters are standing or the hunters were standing. It's just the hunters standing aside. So this is another example of an absolute phrase interrupting the other part of the sentence, the main clause, because we can read, I continue more confidently, allowing me to shuffle through on my way. Oh no, sorry, that doesn't read correctly, does it? It's not interrupting, so I've made a mistake there. Hold my hands up to that. We've actually got a comma for the first absolute phrase, and then we've got the second comma because the allowing is a participle describing hunters. And because it's a participle describing hunters, we need a comma there to show that it's not referring to aside, it's referring to hunters. So the first comma is for the absolute phrase, and the second comma is for the participle phrase describing hunters. And the main clause actually finishes with confidently. I continue more confidently. That's our main clause. Okay, I hope that's been interesting for everybody. I hope that this helps you understand absolute phrases a little better. If you've enjoyed the class, please click on the like button and please subscribe. And I hope to see everybody soon. Thanks for watching.